Welcome to e-flux. My name is Stephen, and it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Mr. Malik Gaines tonight. He is a professor at NYU and a founding member of My Barbarian, a fantastic theater performance organization here in the city. And I, in lieu of a sort of longer introduction, I'm going to read a section from his book called Black Performance on the Outskirts of the Left, A History of the Impossible. And this is from the first chapter, which is about Nina Simone, and it's fabulous. And it's about 2 pages long, and then I will get out of the way. The notion of quadruple consciousness draws its form from Nina Simone's song For Women, which is sung along with the slow, repetitive blues groove of her piano and accompanying bass and percussion. For Women offers a brief chronicle of different women characterized by stereotypical markers of African American femininity: Aunt Sarah, Sweet Thing, Sophronia, and Peaches. For example, the second verse describes Sophronia. My skin is yellow, my hair is long, between 2 worlds I do belong. My father was rich and white, he forced my mother late one night. What do they call me? My name is Sophronia. Each woman is first identified by her coloration and then by the sexual and labor dynamics that frame her identity. Moving seamlessly from one to the next, Simone inhabits each of these roles with transitory but committed determination. Of For Women, which Simone composed and recorded in 1966, she wrote in her co-authored biography, "The women in the song are black, but their skin tone ranges from light to dark, and their ideas of beauty and their own importance are deeply influenced by that. All the song did was to tell what entered the minds of most black women in America when they thought about themselves, their complexions, their hair, straight, kinky, natural, witch, and what other women thought of them. Black women didn't know what the hell they wanted because they were defined by things they didn't control. And until they had the confidence to define themselves, they'd be stuck in the same mess forever." That was the point the song made. When For Women was released in 1966, some black radio stations banned black DJs from playing it because they said it insulted black women. It didn't, and banning it was a stupid thing to do. But I wasn't surprised. The song told a truth that many people in the United States, especially black men, simply weren't ready to acknowledge at the time, end quote. For Women complicates race consciousness with gender consciousness. The work was politically controversial. Significantly, Simone identifies external physical characteristics through which black women achieved self-consciousness by their complexion, hair, and so on. The final woman in the quartet, Peaches, makes a political acknowledgement not found among the others. I'm awfully bitter these days because my parents were slaves. While bound to a historical situation, this figure is able to define herself, thus bringing the song to a close. As Simone reaches her distinctly unsubtle final crescendo, wailing ironically, "My name is Peaches." While Peaches does not control her historical situation and is dissonant with her own name, her active self-definition transgresses the repetitive groove in which these women circulate. In a 1969 concert in Berkeley, California, a recording of which was released as the album Nina Simone Live, Simone offers one of her typical live deconstructions of this controversial number with an elucidating meta-dialogue. As the groove plays, Simone intersperses into her story fourth wall-destroying commentary. She observes that Aunt Jemima is all in vogue everywhere, a sarcastic response to the fashion trend evident in the audience, the wearing of what Simone calls head rags. After she launches the song with an extended and unusually textured version of Aunt Sarah, Simone begins the second verse and then stops herself to address the audience again while the groove plays on. I could tell you a story about my mama in the South when they called her auntie. In these grocery stores. I only wish I had been there when they called her auntie. No, Mrs. Hey. You see, I know Berkeley is on fire. I know that anyway. I say that in a positive way, but I kind of have to hold myself down here. The vibrations are so strong. But I'll tell you this, If I had been there when they had called my mama auntie, I would have burned that whole goddamn place down. Malik Gaines.
Thank you so much. It's great to hear the book in someone else's voice. So thank you. And thank you, e-flux and Amal, for inviting me. As you see from that section, the book looks at performances from the 60s to track a circulation that was transnational of Black political language, and look at the way that that appropriated and was appropriated by international leftist movements in a really sort of active dialogue. Dialogue isn't even dynamic enough to describe it. The sort of larger Black political and Marxist kinds of images get really sort of revised and shifted in specific locations. So I wanted to think about a world that travels around. And so following a certain kind of route, I have a chapter on Nina Simone, I have a chapter on the Ghanaian writers F.O.S. Sutherland and Ama-Ata Edu, and I have a chapter on Fassbinder's anti-theater company, and particularly the uses of the Afro-German actor Günter Kaufmann. And I have a chapter on the Coquettes and Sylvester. And at the end of all of this, I wanted to do a couple things with an afterword. A lot of this was developed as my dissertation and then evolved over many years, and this is sort of like a 10-year project, really. And so I thought, what can I do in an afterword that tracks the kinds of ideas that may or may not have been promised to have been closed off in the kind of space of the 60s? Where do we see these kinds of radical images appearing again? And so I used the 2015 Venice Biennial as a kind of sort of experimental location to think about how these images continue to circulate. And I guess the other sort of practical thing I wanted to do, I did all of this work around music and theater and film and public spectacle, and was sort of relieved for like a decade to never have to argue with or against or through or near a modernist visual art framework. But then I thought, well, a lot of my work comes from that place in performance, my writing, curatorial. How can I sort of reconnect what I found in the 60s with a kind of contemporary art language for expressing it? And so this does both of those things. So I'm going to deliver my afterword to you, which is shorter than a chapter, but it's not that short. So really, I think this takes an hour. So, you know, if you want to close your eyes for a minute, it's okay. There's fun parts, there's serious parts. And I made a keynote so that there's an image with each paragraph. And the first thing I do is include a few epigraphs, which I use throughout the book. So I'll just read those. The first is from Jose Esteban Munoz, who says, "The present is not enough." This is Judith Butler. "Once we reject the view that claims that no political position can rest on performative contradiction, and allow the performative function as a claim and an act whose effects unfold in time, then we can actually entertain the opposite thesis, namely that there can be no radical politics of change without performative contradiction." And finally, a snappy aphorism from Julius Eastman. "At this point, I don't feel that gay guerrillas can really match with Afghani guerrillas or PLO guerrillas, but let us hope in the future that they might." So throughout these pages, I have argued that the raising of different possibilities in performance can be a transformative act, though clearly the 60s and its performances did not altogether revolutionize familiar powers. Economic exploitation, white supremacy, and patriarchy endure. Their reprisals are as discouraging as ever. Whether this is a failure of the 60s, as is sometimes asserted, or a failure of the present might be worth discussing. But the performances I have described suggest that failure and success are not reliable measures. Possibility confirms the co-occurrence of failure and success, and the way negativity is engendered even in a positive result. Here is a condition blackness shares with the idea of possibility. Among its iterations exists at least a doubling of that which definitely is with that which simply cannot. The antagonism so vexing to Dr. Du Bois has outlived him significantly. Race has cleaved its way into the 21st century, organizing disjunctions that have extended modernity's reach. Of special relevance to performance studies has been the expansion of representational technologies, their images distributed through an intensified sphere of visuality, which organizes authority and power around what is seen. This sphere continues to affirm the immanence of blackness as commodity, narrative structure, and identification. It is exchanged as a volatile arrangement of values. It compels dramatic action around conflict and strife, and it activates a position from which to speak into discourse. By now, these processes have played out across a wide swath of historical time, and still today, blackness's performative repertoire is called upon as insistently as ever. Blackness is exhausting activity. The idea of excess that I have drawn from a retrospective understanding of the 60s, a sense that order could be recuperated by declaring that the 60s were too much, resists that very recontainment. The hope that revolutionary self-determination or radically utopian outcomes are just around the corner may be more remote now than they were within the political movements of that time. Under different historical conditions, the volatility of Black performance continues to destabilize categorical distinctions and radicalize its contexts. Importantly, the alienations, demands for multiplicitous production, global flows, and general ambivalence of contemporary capitalist life are well met by Blackness, which has developed a language for addressing those very conditions. This resemblance between Blackness and contemporary economic conditions should not be mistaken for collusion. Resistance, a force so evident in these performances of the 60s, still activates Black performances that find themselves persistently interested in that history. Today, there is the opportunity to include among Blackness's ambivalent techniques an ambivalent approach to the 60s and its politics. Within that, radical energy persists and can be deployed apart from linear claims of historical progress that appear to disprove themselves. This concluding section reads that energy from the point of view of 2015, locating modes of resistant representations that have exceeded the 60s, offering a sense of resistance's reach and flexibility. Situated in this moment, I approach this concluding section from the subjective position of a Black performer, with the hope of intensifying the presence of Black performance. From the spring to fall of 2015, inside a centuries-old brick watchtower backed against the historic port of Venice, Italy, 10 Black audio speakers were installed at ear level surrounding the space. The speakers delivered the voices of 10 singers singing the German national anthem in 10 African languages. One voice began, the others joined, until a chorus surrounded the listener with overlapping languages, performing the same heavy tune, the song of the Germans, Lied der Deutschen, in Douala, Igbo, Lingala, Bamun, Kikongo, Yoruba, Sango, More, Tree, and Ewondo. Each time the song began again, a different voice, a different language, and again, the others filled in the chorus. I encountered this work by Emeka Ogbo in the exhibition organized for the 56th Venice Biennial, which in 2015 included an unprecedented number of Black artists from the United States, Europe, and Africa. The biennial's curator, Okwi Nwezor, a Nigerian man who has held curatorial and academic posts in Europe and the United States, as the only black person ever to have been appointed to that job. I made the trip to see the show and to celebrate the occasion with friends and colleagues and my artist father, whose work was included. The Venice Biennial was founded in 1895 and still maintains a World's Fair quality connected to that time, with its national art pavilions and international group exhibition, assembling a diversity of modernities and modernisms that have by now been assimilated into globalist exchange. While the art world's leading destinations are regular subjects of pilgrimage for the artists, curators, writers, collectors, and other professionals who do its work, this particular event, given its participants, was of anomalous interest as an object of black study. While there, I was enlisted to participate in a performance by musicians Alicia Hall Moran and Jason Moran. On my last day in Venice, I worked through their piece from a central stage, and then, with suitcase in tow, I set out to see the far reaches of the gigantic exhibition and discovered there Ogbo's Tower. And hearing those voices singing that song, I found myself moved. Ogbo's piece is an example of music transporting historical resonances across time, troubling ontologies along the way. While emphasizing the place of song and of oral traditions in the making of black subjectivity, I do not wish here to romanticize sound as an unfettered force that necessarily leads to liberation, but rather wish to consider sound's flexible communicative powers within visuality, even when conscribed to the fixities of its disciplines. Following scholars of black musical production, this history suggests what Tavia Nyong'o has described as a demand to listen to the black body as a musical and technical instrument that resound at frequencies that confound its routinized, racialized instrumentation. The works discussed here elaborate on music as, in Shanna Redmond's words, quote, a method of rebellion, revolution, and future visions. And Wazer's exhibition was insidiously aural, carefully orchestrating its sounds around objects, video installations, and live interventions. His performance selections moved away from the body and toward its voice. A central arena stage built for readings and performances served as a platform for the voice of the biennial. This emphasis on sound in a visual art context offered modes that exceed the auspices of visuality. Distributed across the spaces of the biennial, sound offered echoes of a resistant past while announcing possible futures. Emeka Ogbo's Song of the Germans raises important connections between history, nationalism, and performance, as in those unpacked by Judith Butler and Gayatri Spivak in their text, Who Sings the Nation State? The anthem, originally composed by Joseph Haydn for an imperial birthday, rises and falls in the manner of Western music's most satisfying melodic mode. It was used in the German unification effort in the 1840s as various principalities were becoming a state. A nationalistic poem was set to the melody at that time, the third stanza of which is the anthem of today's reunified Germany. This is the stanza adapted by Ogbo and his singers, who are members of an Afro-German gospel choir based in Berlin. The stanza calls for the principles Einigkeit und Recht und Freiheit, unity and justice and freedom, reflective of the Enlightenment terms that generally inform the development of the most orderly nation states. There are other original stanzas of the song that are no longer used. The second celebrates, quote, German women, German loyalty, German wine, and German song, offering a seemingly medieval premise for the modern project. These features are celebrated as elements of an essential past, which inspires future deeds, emanating from their alten schönen Klang, old beautiful tone. Sound carries this historicity into the future, as in the song's self-reflexive reference to song itself, and never mind that Haydn was Austrian. The notion that women are either abstractions, like loyalty, or cultural products, like wine, rather than agents of a unified, just, and free history, is out of step with the Germany of Angela Merkel and partially accounts for this stanza's relegation to history. A founding national identity also pushes through the other stanza that is never officially sung, the first, which begins Deutschland, Deutschland über alles, Germany, Germany above all, and is closely associated in the imagination with the National Socialist regime. Its opening declaration is perhaps the most familiar aspect of this song to non-Germans, given the breadth of the conquering project it accompanied in the 30s and 40s. For me, at least, hearing the anthem's melody conjures those words more readily than unity, justice, or freedom. This content is accompanied by the melody's affective strength, its conveyance of beauty and resolution, reinforcing the rightness of that claim. It reminds me in some ways of Dixie, the unofficial anthem of the Confederate States of America, which, using mannered sentimentality rather than courtly elegance, also conveys a melancholic past that underscores a desired future. That pretty tune romanticizes the southern US it describes through a longing that is something like what Germans call Sehnsucht, and never mind that Dixie was written in Chicago for a minstrel show. In 2015, Germany's political strength as economic arbiter for the European Union was a tense political matter. Some German visitors to Venice described to me the resentment they sensed while traveling in Southern Europe. An activist art action at the German pavilion referencing Greece's current debt crisis denounced Germany's austerity policies. The artist Hito Sterl's video installation, Factory of the Sun, inside that same pavilion, expressed a highly critical attitude toward the German financial sector, even offering a sarcastic gesture linking it to Nazism. While such a comparison may be hyperbolic, the problem of German power is again a European concern. The raciality of that national power resonates in Ogbo's Tower, sung in those 10 languages, some of which come from former German colonial territory. The patriotic song is articulated in utterances that, to most Germans, may as well be Greek. In Who Sings the Nation State, Butler describes protesters in California singing the American national anthem in Spanish as an instance of resistance. Reading Hannah Arendt and Giorgio Agamben, Butler keeps the nation-state's extraordinary ordering abilities in view while imagining how the movement in and out of territory and citizenship choreographs challenges to state power. Here's a little Butler block. A certain distance or fissure becomes the condition of possibility of equality, which means that equality is not a matter of extending or augmenting the homogeneity of the nation. Of course, this might be no more than a pluralism which, as we know, reinstalls homogeneity only after a little complexity is admitted into the fold. But if we consider this both as plural act and as speech and translation, then it seems to me that we witness at least two conditions that are at work, not only in the assertion of equality, but in the exercise of freedom. Both the ontologies of liberal individualism and the ideas of a common language are forfeited in favor of a collectivity that comes to exercise its freedom in a language or a set of languages for which difference and translation are irreducible. Butler recognizes at least two conditions in a common action that resists homogenizing state force in one move while maintaining difference through translation in another. As Spivak observes in Conversation, quote, the national anthem, unlike the international or we shall overcome, is untranslatable. In this example, and in Ogbo's piece, we observe the loss of the nationalistic requirement in translation, and with it, its unifying demand. Patriotism lacks continuity without the authorizing and authenticating claim that would be laid by common use of the national language. Ogbo, who was born in 1977 in Enugu, Nigeria, is a contemporary artist based in both Lagos and Berlin, whose works have exploited sounds, politicizing, and effective powers. He is the winner of a German competition commissioning a public artwork for the planned African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, the construction of which is also backed by Germany. This building, I think, is done now, actually. In his proposed work, Ogbo is to build a sound installation using the anthem of the African Union, Let Us All Unite and Celebrate Together. as well as recordings of speeches delivered in 1963 at the opening of an older organization, the Organization of African Unity, at the high point of African independence. In her book Anthem, Redmond describes comparable political songs that resist nationalist participation in favor of extranational affinities. Quote, "The Black and interracial organizations that these anthems represent serve to rebut, reorient, or reimagine the state's role in the lives of Black citizens," a strategy characteristic of Black transnationalism in the 60s. "Let Us All Unite and Celebrate Together" announces this historic intention and represents it as an occasion for festive pleasure, accessing an affect produced by collective singing in connection to new forms of belonging. Reflecting this moment's utopian possibility, Ghanaian President Kwame Nkrumah's speech on that occasion called for a politically unified continent that would overcome the neo-colonial forces preventing African economic control over its vast natural resources. Nkrumah says, "So many blessings must flow from our unity, so many disasters must follow on our continued disunity, that our failure to unite today will not be attributed by posterity only to faulty reasoning and the lack of courage, but to our capitulation before the forces of imperialism." Nkrumah alludes to the American Constitutional Convention as a model for post-colonial organization, an image that recalls a founding democratic past while projecting great future power, and delivers a lengthy critique of the ways Africans have been deprived of their own capital, and how they may revolutionize that condition, articulating his African Marxist analysis. Nkrumah's extraordinary plan, which called for new cooperative bodies, a new common currency, common citizenship, common defense, and other major innovations, was not put into effect. Instead, the Organization of African Unity, which came to serve autocratic rather than cooperative states, was finally dissolved in 2002 and replaced with the African Union, which now looks to Germany to build its headquarters. In both of these works by Agbo, the problem of Einigkeit resonates, as sound carries, or is proposed to carry, presence, history, and possibility with ambivalence. The time between Nkrumah's predictions and today's past holds big disappointments that shadow political promises. In the case of the Lied der Deutschen, the music unfurls the banners of globalist present and, by implication, fascist and imperial legacies that linger behind the voices. Even within this intractable history, African singularities surround the listener in possibility, confounding the meanings that confine it. In Hortense Spiller's attention to expressive production, one is reminded that what happens in a field of representation is still very important, as it makes the meanings that support ways of living. Having provided as thorough a definition of race as any, Spillers explains, here's a Spillers chunk, race, in quotes, marks both an in-itselfness and a figurative economy that can take on any number of different faces at the drop of a hat. Understanding how this mechanism works is crucial. Race is not simply a metaphor and nothing more. It is the outcome of politics. For one to mistake it is to be politically stupid and endangered. It is also a complicated figure, or metaphoricity, that demonstrates the power and danger of difference, that signs and assigns difference as a way to situate social subjects. If we did not already have race and its quite impressive powers of proliferation, we would need to invent them. The social mechanism here is difference in and as hierarchy, although race remains one of its most venerable master signs. Everywhere we look, there is doubling, at least. Race is both the condition of social assignment and the economy that assigns. This multiplication creates ontological problems. It's difficult to imagine modernity without race and its power to situate being, and that being is situated through confounding difference. In the sphere of the racialized, status is precariously balanced in hierarchical arrangement. The historical is hounded by the contingent. In its multiplicity, race is outrageously anti-ontological, considering its incredible claims of definition. In the previous chapters, I have pursued the ways Du Bois's double consciousness had given way to radical proliferations of consciousnesses as politicized subjective modes by the 60s, when resolution was no longer a primary goal. These performances enacted a complicated set of positions, foregrounding the decentering powers of gender, sexuality, location, and other differences that productively multiplied racial categories in excess of the boundaries that might contain them. Distinct from the notion of unified consciousness, Spillers goes on to describe a kind of, quote, interior intersubjectivity that more fully depicts a Black psychic situation, shaped by the social positions made available to it. There is no recourse here to the discrete individual as agential being. There is rather ambivalent situation and intertextual arrangement, and in this sense, the utterance and the act are embedded in performative contradiction. Attention to thinking about being reveals beyond race the pluralities that categories organize. As Arendt muses, quote, "For all scientific thinking, there is only man. In biology or psychology, as in philosophy and theology, just as in zoology, there is only the lion. Lions would be of concern only to lions." The category of study is singular and general, while the singularities within each category raise differences of particular interest only to the subjectivities that are differentiated in the first place, the metaphorical plural lions. Reflecting that problem, Agamben refers to being as an unfixed process. Quote, "This is not, in the terms that dominate Western ontology, either an essence or an existence, but a manner of rising forth, not a being that is in this or that mode, but a being that is its mode of being." In this plural manner, there remains a singularity within each thing that is distinct from general category to which it belongs, opening up multiple possibilities within each proper instance. Still, possibility itself is shown to contain the possibility of not. Each thing that may occur may just as determinedly not occur. Possibility maintains substantial negative power. Tracing a Christian philosophical tradition, Agamben describes original sin as the retroactive organization of this negative possibility in an originary past, for which morality is a compensatory mode. Ethics, accordingly, returns possibility to the future, where it may or may not happen, and anticipates ways of moving toward those outcomes. Possibility is not the project of changing one totality into another. Possibility is an attunement of being's manner of being, which time does nothing to unify, and a consciousness of the impossible. Curator Okwuyen Wezor's writing for the Venice Biennial Exhibition catalog addresses capitalism's rapacity, a current state of political upheaval, and impending climate disaster, implying that at least one possible future is a non-future. Quote, "All the world's futures are not presented in the affirmative key," he writes, distancing himself from the utopian premises that might be inferred from his exhibition title. And Wezor described himself in an interview with the activist American news program Democracy Now!, broadcast canal-side from Venice as, quote, "deeply anti-utopia, simply because I believe that utopia is the end of politics, and I'm very much invested in the politics of the possible." Herein Wezor affirms the future's limitations. He departs from the kind of critical idealism described by José Muñoz in Cruising Utopia, the then and there of queer futurity, which follows Agamben and Ernst Bloch to take possibility all the way to potentiality, a less indifferent, more promising futurity. Muñoz describes his critical utopianism in queer terms, critiquing the, quote, auto-naturalizing temporality we call straight time, by offering a horizon of experience outside that temporality's reproductive order and a collectivity founded in that experience. This vision looks past the negativity that disbands collective potential. Muñoz's unfinished work on the idea of the brown commons rethinks the pessimism that of color critique has inherited from Black study. And Wezor's project, on the other hand, returns to that difficulty. In the Democracy Now! Interview, Nwezor cites the 60s as an instigator of his project. Quote, "I came from a generation of the post-independence era in Nigeria in the 60s, born in the 60s, growing up in Nigeria with a sense of purpose, a sense of the fact that the world is round, the sense of the idea of a complex entanglement of destinies and processes. And arriving in the United States, and seeing myself on the margins of that was not really what I thought my life should be." And Nwezor ends this anecdote with a classical invocation of double consciousness, out of which he developed inventive and multiplicitous production. Invoking this productive alienation, the program cuts away from Nwezor before a break as Nina Simone's version of Strange Fruit, Billie Holiday's darkly ironic song about lynching, plays over a video montage of protests in Missouri. The protesters are responding to the shooting of African-American teenager Michael Brown by a police officer. These protests formed the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, which has responded to the increased visibility of instances of police violence against Black people, which have been distributed through new video technologies. Black futures perpetually reroute us to the here and now. The question of time as history and as a measure of action was insistently posed by a months-long reading of the 3 books of Karl Marx's Capital in the center of the exhibition, a reading Nwezor describes as a main component of his curatorial premise. Importantly, the idea of reading Capital aloud placed performance squarely in the center of the biennial, with the construction of the square arena stage facing the audience on 3 sides, and many performances filling out discursive spaces around Marx's analysis. British artist Jeremy Deller offered a program of historic labor ballads. American musicians Alicia Hall Moran and Jason Moran responded to Black American work songs, to which I will return shortly. My artist father, Charles Gaines, presented a composition that translated political speech into musical notation, and other performances and screenings enlivened the occasion. Marx's text loses fixity in Nwezor's context. The exhibition catalog offers images of first edition title pages of Capital, published in Bengali, Arabic, Serbian, Croatian, Danish, Czech, French, English, Dutch, Italian, Yiddish, Polish, Russian, Persian, Thai, Indonesian, Kazakh, Uyghur, and Telugu. While this suggests the internationalism of that influential writing, attention to the histories of the places where these languages are spoken diminishes a sense of uniformity in its reading. And Nwezor enlisted the British film and video artist Isaac Julian to direct the live reading. Julian's work has also circulated widely and has offered specific influence on Black and queer art practices with pieces such as the 1989 film Looking for Langston, an ambivalent meditation on the legacy of Langston Hughes. Working with his partner Mark Nash, Julia's staging of Das Kapital oratorio heightened dialogic processes. 2 readers alternated from either side of the stage. The reader spoke English with cumbersome Italian accents. The reading was accompanied by a projection of Marx's footnotes annotating the speech. The oratorio offered a concrete engagement with politics, while its performed difficulties kept multiplicity alive. The Capital Oratorio followed up on Julian's earlier piece, Capital, a 2-channel video presented in London in 2013 and also on view in Venice, in which Julian interviews the Marxist scholar David Harvey in a gallery space, surrounded by an attentive audience. Intermittently, video montages splash across the walls of the gallery, offering bits of economic information, scenes of commerce and trade, and enactments of political crisis. Meanwhile, Julian asks Harvey about capital's conditions. Answering the implicit question of whether or not capital is still relevant, Harvey insists that Marx capably expresses contemporary crises, describing the ways capital's motion, acceleration, and precarity are as persistent as ever. Julian mentions Marx's idea that value, as an expression of capital, quote, brings forth living offspring, or, at the least, lays golden eggs, and suggests a resemblance in that image to contemporary art objects bought for outrageous amounts by billionaire oligarchs, ruling families, and the like. Harvey returns attention to the idea of the fetish and reminds the audience that this produces jobs for no one but a few artists like Julian. A couple of lucid questioners wonder if capital is better suited to address large ontologies, such as capital and art, and less adept at analyzing the more detailed places of differentiation within those categories where much meaning can be found. Harvey turns attention to strata of analysis attributed to Marx: the universal, which includes a relationship to nature; the general, where capital's rules dominate; the particular, where variables like wages, rents, and interest rates fluctuate; and the singularity, the place of consumption, where we might recognize our own individual drives and, quote, human passion. Cultural theorist Stuart Hall, who is also in the audience, suggests that Harvey's strata do not go far enough to uncover contemporary condition and calls for a stronger revisionism. Hall asserts that a revisionist approach might better account for something in Marx's own writing that attends to the productive, the masculine, the factory, while paying less attention to reproduction and consumption, processes which have moved into the foreground of present capitalist life. Though Harvey disagrees, Hall insists that capital does not depict current economic experience, which is ambiguous in that it lacks clear demarcations between classes. With the diminishment of factory production, the privileged proletariat class is no longer so contiguous or complete. Julian's video montages that appear within the video include a constructed cinematic scene of suited white-collar workers battling riot police, suggesting that perhaps hedge fund managers might form part of today's revolutionary class. Hall cautions, however, that simply expanding the idea of the proletariat to include different kinds of workers makes everyone proletariat and is not at all a solution. Hall points finally to the fact that capital does not account for gender or race, affirming that further revision to Marx's model is called for. Harvey, characteristically, sticks to his guns, replying that you cannot use race or gender to theorize economic crisis. Quote, "You can only look at the way capital is racialized and genderized." This back and forth, set within a video that itself is an art commodity, reveals some of the differences Marx can bring us to. Crucially, Hall's intervention restages the kinds of revisions, adaptations, and interpretations Black political projects have brought to Marxist analysis, including those of the 60s that I have discussed in depth. While this exchange shows how capital continues to productively shape political discourse, attention to Black performance and its relationship to leftist projects shows the necessity of revision when thinking about social differences unarticulated in the figure of the European factory worker. Reflecting this tradition of revision, Hall, an influential figure in the British New Left, called for openness where it came to Marx. Here's a Hall block. This relative openness or relative indeterminacy is necessary to Marxism itself as a theory. What is scientific about the Marxist theory of politics is that it seeks to understand the limits to political action given by the terrain on which it operates. This terrain is defined not by forces we can predict with the certainty of natural science, but by the existing balance of social forces, the specific nature of the concrete conjuncture. It is, quote, scientific because it understands itself as determinate, and because it seeks to develop a practice which is theoretically informed, but is not scientific in the sense that political outcomes and the consequences of the conduct of political struggles are foreordained in the stars. This reading, identifying a useful science of economics that ought not cross into prognostication, opens two important possibilities, at least. First, an incorporation into Marxist theory of the value of different social configuration than those detailed by Marx himself. Second, a resistance to the notion that Marxism, or all of politics for that matter, have come to fail, as made evident by the present lack of a world workers' government that ought to have been an historical inevitability. Hall's body of writing, which pays attention to race and colonialism, made an important contribution to this first result, helping to retain Marxist analysis as a critical tool for those marginalized by more than industrial class. By bringing historical material attention to Blackness, Julian has argued that Hall ushered in, quote, the end of the innocent, essential black subject and the freeing up of positions from which black artists and filmmakers can speak. The second matter, the retention of Marxist analysis in the 21st century and its adaptability, is the proposition of the oratorio at the center of a world art exhibition that necessarily featured several golden eggs. Some news reports and online comments suggested there was a contradiction to the reading of Capital in the biennial's Giardini building, while outside, enormous yachts lined the waterfront. And further, that the oratorio would have been better illuminated than the yachts. This response said, perversely, yachts are material, Marxism is a fantasy, like the 60s, like performance for that matter. I attended a party on a yacht while in Venice. I judged the yacht to be quite expensive. I was the guest of an artist friend who told me it was a birthday party for a young museum worker. That worker was the daughter of contemporary art collectors whose family fortune, I later discovered, derived from the dealing of weapons. Their big collection includes the work of several artists seen in the biennial, including Isaac Julian's. Class extremities frame contemporary art. If reading Capital does nothing to revolutionize this economy, it may at least propose a demystification of its fetishes. In Black production, music allows for a kind of rising forth, a manner of being, played out in time, capable of managing performative contradiction and open to revision. Music has served as a cultural and formal context that supports the kinds of multiplicitous expressions I have identified in performances of the 60s, expressions that refuse unification and represent possibility. In Wazor's exhibition laid claim to this Black cultural practice and positioned it as a foundation of modernity. The biennial used music to transport past energies to the present and to imagine and reimagine the future. This choice, in an art exhibition, put pressure on the status of the object and, in relation to that, of the social subject. I conclude with 3 final instances of music that used multiplicities of Black subjectivity to find a way toward futurity. On the arena stage, 4 pianists played 4 grand pianos with large clocks set upon them, interpreting the composition Evil Nigger by Julius Eastman. Composed in 1979, the piece calls for a number of instruments of the same type and is most often done using 4 pianos. The musicians worked with 2 repeating themes, a vigorous repetition of 16th notes, and a set of specific time constraints, while improvising within those limitations. The piece produces a kind of quadruple consciousness, not unlike that expressed by Nina Simone in 4 Women, as the same musical information moves through 4 very skilled pianists, coming apart and together in ways that maintain difference while fulfilling the intensity suggested by the composition's title. The first theme is made of a quick progression of 3 notes and then the aggressive repetition of the third, like a demand with the insistency of gunfire. The second theme, which is first played in unison by the 4 pianists, is a progression of notes ominously working their way down a minor scale, a simple, dark statement. A conductor, watching the time closely, guides the players from section to section. As new tones and overlapping key shifts enter this nearly 30-minute piece, the repetitions begin to produce a soundscape of energy. Despite the music's simplicity, it requires of the pianist's nearly athletic determination to maintain the labor. Evil Nigger is not easy to perform. Preceding this performance by non-Black Italian pianists, an audio clip was played, a recording of Eastman addressing the audience in 1980 at Chicago's Northwestern University, where the piece was presented along with the other works in its series, Crazy Nigger and Gay Gorilla. In the run-up to that performance, the work's titles had stirred controversy. Eastman, who was Black and gay, offers an assured explanation saying he uses nigger to describe something, quote, fundamental, as in the field labor that was fundamental to the American economy. This fundamental quality can be extended to the minimalist strategies contained within the piece, both its repetition of themes and the idea that most all of the musical information is immediately present, rather than introduced and developed in a progression throughout various movements. Presence, immediacy, and forcefulness all seem to reflect Eastman's claiming of the word. In the predominantly white world of difficult new music in which Eastman circulated, organized around a few schools, residencies, and music groups, the use of such contested, politicized language was not standard. Since Eastman was African American, writes David Borden, he could use the word with a certain freedom that is not appropriate for the rest of us. The word connotes racism, lynching, slavery, injustice, unimaginable suffering, and so on and so forth. Julius knew perfectly well what the word invoked and used it to make audiences come face to face with it. After all, he had to every day. Eastman's use of the word was inevitably a reference to himself, very often the only black person in the room, a reference that radicalized his endeavor, connecting his authorship with the so on and so forth of blackness. Eastman's music expressed this radicality. As a former lover describes, quote, "He lived the titles of his music. He was the crazy nigger and the gay gorilla. He was fearsome. He played out those roles." Eastman's difficult position in his field brought him into legendary conflict with the influential composer John Cage, the leading figure in new music. Though Cage was also gay, his work did not support an idea of provocation founded in the politicized identity of the composer. His practice of reduction delimited the necessity of such positions. In an instance in 1975, Eastman introduced, quote, virulent homosexual overtones to a performance of a Cage work from 1970, filling out a limited set of instructions in the piece songbooks by, among other things, narrating and acting out an interracial sexual scenario with a young naked white man. According to Eastman biographer Renee Levine Packer, quote, Cage was furious. In his seminar the next morning, he was visibly agitated, stamping around the room, breathlessly raising his voice in an uncharacteristic way, even pounding the piano with his fist. Eastman's career was damaged by antagonizing Cage, who did not approve of sexual and racial specificity being connected to his work. Eastman died in 1990 at the age of 49, alone and in near obscurity. Recent writings such as Levine Packer's has drawn renewed attention to his remarkable work. Given the demands of Evil Nigger, it is a challenge to mount live. Its performance spoke to the labor of transporting excessive production across time. Not only does the piece convey Eastman's persistence, but also reenacts the antagonism a Black and queer subjectivity activates, even within avant-gardist spaces that are often understood to question normative positions and reject bourgeois expectations. Though the performance will not easily resolve, the labor time depicted cannot fully synthesize the Black energy it articulates. Overlapping, repeated notes will not line up in order. They exceed both formal and historical conditions. Strategies of repetition and reduction also resonate in the large silkscreen prints on canvas of American artist Glenn Ligon on view in a gallery beside the arena stage. A musical scene related to Eastman's own acted itself out behind these works. Paired with an installation by conceptual artist Adrian Piper, Ligon's work pursued his established practice of appropriating and depicting texts associated with Black cultural production. Ligon borrowed the phrase, "come out to show them," from an early work of minimalist composer Steve Reich, who borrowed it for his 1966 piece, Come Out, from the recorded testimony of Daniel Ham, who was arrested in 1964 in Harlem and suffered injuries from a beating by police. In an effort to make the wounds evident, Ham describes pressing a bruise so the blood would come out to show them the proof of extraordinary violence. In Reich's piece, which involved manipulating a tape recording of Ham's voice and playing it on 2 channels, a recorded phrase is introduced without alteration, then repeated, then shortened, and repeated in quick succession. Ham's voice begins to divide across the channels, fragmenting and overlapping itself. As the channels move out of sync, the utterance is transformed into a sequence of sounds. The description of the action is literally instrumentalized as the voice becomes material for abstraction. The piece has a complex effect. It introduces the fragment of political speech and multiplies it, amplifying a sense of subjectivity while removing the requirement to produce meaning. Performative speech becomes a speech object that is used performatively. Even though the signs are extracted, the music is still difficult, as the resulting rapid rhythm proves quite intense. By the end of 12 minutes, there is scarcely a sense of voice present, but rather a percussive, mechanized whirl. Come Out followed Reich's 1965 work, It's Gonna Rain, which also manipulated a recording of black speech, sampling fragments of a street preacher's sermon recorded by Reich in San Francisco. By isolating different syllables and combinations of syllables, a series of abstract patterns are produced which, because of the speaker's musical oratory style, convey much tonality. These pieces attempt to hold on to something of their source materials. Reich maintains the original pitch of the voice, fragmenting and distributing it, but doing little else to mediate it. This suggests an interest in making connections among the compositional strategy, the recording technology, and the black social subject matter that underlies the sound. In the case of Come Out, Reich had been hired by an activist to edit interviews with Ham and others known as the Harlem Six, who, after a minor street altercation, were coerced into confessing to a white woman's murder, and whose case symbolized for many systemic police racism. Reich took the job with the understanding that he could make work from that sound archive. He adapted not only the sound, but the political event of which he was well aware, as Andrew Urowski describes, quote, explicitly aligning the emerging interest in the possibilities of looped recording and feedback with the explosive social and cultural dynamics of the civil rights movement. In his act of retranslation, Ligon printed the original utterance as a text, which he repeated in black layers across the surface of his imposing works. The words are translated from language to image and back as they recede and return into legibility. The attempt to be seen that is invoked in the phrase is fulfilled in the materiality of the large-scale prints, which surround the viewer in their repetitive patterns. As in other Ligon works, the labor of applying layers of medium produces moments of unintelligibility in the text image, allowing the phrase to disappear and reappear under the work of representing it. And though no body literally appears, black or otherwise, a question of sexuality emerges around the racialized content, as the practice of coming out, or making one's gay identity visible, appears to speak through the phrase when viewed in the context of 2015, proposing a collusion between that artist's voice, Reich's, and Ham's. Ligon's work reappropriates an appropriation and offers in that repetition a depiction of an intersubjectivity stretched through space and time. Returning to the question of revision raised by Hall, this text too expands its capacity as the voice of the accused testifies, multiplies, and transforms. In these pieces and others, Ligon and Eastman have both used black historical conditions to revise the minimalist demands that shape their work's reception. Within influential music and visual art discourses since the 60s, a critical interest in repetition and reduction has worked against dramatic tendencies in order to free form from narrative structures that have been seen as coercive and illusionistic. Writing about Ligon's series of prints, Megan Ratner quotes the minimalist sculptor Richard Serra, who describes his memory of Reich's work many years later. Quote, I don't recall the structure or concise logic. What I retain is a feeling of alienation and discomfort. It might seem strange, but this discomfort arises from a rethinking of form. Stranger, perhaps, is to understand the racist violence to which Ham's utterance responds as something distinct from the form of its recorded sound. That this distinction is received as alienation, a term bound to Marx's analysis of labor, Brecht's politicized performance tactic, and Du Bois's critique of self as other, reorients the formal problem around one of content and the radicalizing identities that animate these materials. In Ligon's Come Out, as in Eastman's Evil Nigger, the strategy of repetition, far from limiting politicized content, serves as a reiteration of subjectivity, an excessive layering of Black narrative, offering flesh as the material of form. These works cleverly undermine the universalist sensibilities that have shaped the fields through which these artists' works have been distributed, and the art discourse to which the Venice Biennial itself responds. Further, these works' queer undercurrents unsettle even the Black historical conditions to which they refer, flowing toward a horizon of ambiguous, subjective pleasure. Finally, I turn to Work Songs, a performance by Alicia Hall Moran and Jason Moran, which foregrounded an understanding of Black performance as Black labor. Hall Moran is a vocalist whose projects have included performing the role of Bess in the 2013 US national tour of the Gershwins' Porgy and Bess, a retooling of the 1934 opera about Black American life, which synthesizes classical, jazz, and theater music. Moran is a pianist and band leader who presently serves as artistic director for jazz at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., a post that places Black music in close proximity to the machinery of the U.S. nation-state. The pair was invited by Nwezor to work through the idea of the work song on the arena stage, bringing that form into contact with the reading of Capital. This position proposes an alternate theory of labor to complement Marx's own, one founded in a collective vocalization that speaks back to the repetitious rhythms of work. In a series of performances throughout the run of the biennial, Moran and Hall Moran brought singers together in different solo, duo, and trio performances to work through an improvisatory structure that played against a 38-minute recording of rhythms, voices, and music in loops. The recording subtly referenced fieldwork, chain gangs, spirituals, instrumental improvisation, the kind of tape music innovated by Reich, and electronic sampling found in popular idioms. The track, in combinatory form, created a progression upon which different voices could engage with the labor of the work song in regulated time. That labor never produced the same results. It was always both singular and collective. A diverse range of singers participated: Rashida Bumbre, Roosevelt Andre Credit, Latasha in Nevada Diggs, Lisa Harris, Stephen Herring, Andrea Jones Sojola, Anthony Mills, Jamet Pittman, Fumzile Sojola, and me. All of them associates of the artist pair. Many of these are trained singers who work in classical, jazz, Broadway, and commercial contexts, though some, like myself, use music as part of art production outside of the professional field of music. I saw a performance of work songs during the exhibition's opening days that included Moran seated at the piano, Hall Moran standing at a music stand, and dance artist and curator Rashida Bumbre standing at another music stand. Though the singers wore elegant gowns, the performance was a practice of restraint, offering a limited vocabulary of chords, voice, and movement, emphasizing work's regulated expression. While steeped in a history of work music, the performers made evident their negotiation of the present. In an unplanned moment, Hall Moran, having asked for water and having been brought a Coca-Cola instead, guzzled the drink with a kind of triumphant disdain. The action embodied the contradictions inherent in performing material rooted in American slavery for an international art audience in an old European capital of trade and with only a global commodity to drink. The openness of the improvisatory mode exposed the pleasures and pains of Black work. Finding themselves in need of a performer later that weekend, the Morans asked me to perform an iteration of work songs. Though I had come to visit Venice as a researcher, tourist, and supporter, I was excited to perform as well. A stricter series of instructions were delivered to singers who appeared later in the series. I, however, was given relative freedom to interpret the piece as best I could, having been told by Hall Moran only that I must repeatedly sing the word work, and that I should focus on a couple of American folk songs she had been writing notes about. John Henry, a legendary figure whose incredible performance of power leads to his death at work, and the suppositional utopian affirmation of action, If I Had a Hammer. While I entered the process with a strong sense of the texts and the subjectivities they announce, performing in this piece taught me something about improvisation's instability. Structure and freedom indicate each other. Compulsory regimes open up passages to imaginative interpretation. I played piano and sang at the same time, and though I would not call my performance virtuoso, I would say it communicated. The following day, after having arrived in Lisbon, Portugal for a vacation, I wrote a summary email, 5/11/15. Alicia, Jason, I loved doing that performance. Thank you so much for inviting me in your hour of need. It reminded me that I need to do more of that kind of thing. I'm a rehearser more than an improviser, but it was such a great challenge to bring those two parts together. It stretched me in a productive way to try to listen and express at the same time. You guys are inspiring and generous to let me do my thing. I heard from others that Rashida's solo turn was wonderful. Music, theater, and dance people all know how to collaborate, and it's such a stretch for art people. I love that you brought that into the biennial, even by accident. The only person I knew there was a woman who runs the Montreal Biennial. She shot video on her phone and got at least 31 minutes of it. She hasn't sent it to me yet, but she said she would. She never did. I'll send it along as soon as I get it. I chanted work for a while, adding some work it and do your thing, references to RuPaul's 90s dance hit, which I'm sure no one could notice. I worked through Nina Simone's work song, the spirituals Hammering and Gospel Plow. I did a full version of John Henry to that active piano section, delivering a lot of that to a small German child with thick glasses. I improvised with If I Had a Hammer, imagining different things I'd hammer out. I played with Odetta's He Had a Long Chain On and Your Son Has Been Shot from My Barbarian's Brecht songs. Concluded working through Elaine Brown's End of the Silence, a complicated song from her 60s album of Black Panther propaganda. As you see, I decided I had to bring some of my familiar material to this in order to be able to improvise and still feel confident, but always connecting to your themes and realizing how much spiritual work and political songs overlap in this music tradition. They're so often doing the same thing. I think it all worked well. Folks stuck around to watch it. The crew guys complimented my singing, which was nice. Then I wandered to the back of the Arsenale and discovered that piece where different Afro-Germans are singing the German national anthem all at once in different African languages, and I burst into tears. Then I came to Lisbon where my suitcase was lost, but I think it's been found. But as of now, I only have the clothes I performed in. What a world. Love to you both, and congratulations. Alicia Halmoran responded hours later. All I can really say in response to this email is I love you and welcome to jazz. To conclude with love is to return to resistance. Despite the world of constraints, despite history's exhausting claims, and all of the ways race punishes us all, Black expressivity continues to draw on its contradictory traditions of defiance and affirmation, intensity and multiplicity, slavery and self-rule, antagonism and identification, ambivalence and commitment to ideate life worth living, life imagined on the other side of impossibility. In the performances of the 60s I have considered, and in the works of All the World's Futures discussed here, Blackness endures, not only as a mode of subjection, but as a deeply energetic position from which to communicate. All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Billy. Do we do questions here, or do we just have wine and stuff? Yeah, we can have questions. Yeah. Or even, half-baked comments, or deeply thought-through, three-part, multi-clause interrogations. Or, insults even. I can take it up to a point. stunned into silence, overwhelmed with the prose, the content. Yeah? Anna? Yeah, with wine. Carlos? With wine. All right, cool. It was very nice to speak this with you. The book just came out in the fall with NYU Press, and the people from NYU Press are present in the back with a little display at the kiosk if you are interested. A little bit of moving the material forward here. And yeah, thank you.